Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus get to help each other make sense of this world. And today's podcast, I'm joined with a bunch of friends, but especially I am rejoined by my good friend, David French. David, welcome back.
Founding friend.
Founding friend.
Yes.
And if you hear that applause, it's because David's not the only person in the room. We're here at the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities Multi-Academic Conference. It's a room full of Christian higher ed, deans, provosts, faculty, chaplains, student life leaders, as like basically the people who are doing the work of forming the next generation of Christians, at least through Christian higher ed. And we're here tonight because we get the privilege to share some of our thoughts with them. And we're going to share with them thoughts about what the next generation of Christians need. That's the topic for tonight. What does the next generation of Christians need? And this is a topic that is very close to both of our hearts, David, because you have a long history with Christian colleges.
I'm a CCCU graduate. Yeah. I graduated from Lipscomb University. Anybody here from Lipscomb? There were Monday night. Yeah. Not tonight. Okay, that's unfortunate. But I went to a CCCU school. I think I've spoken at 36 maybe CCCU schools over the course of my career. I've debated, I've spoken, I've podcasted, I've done chapel talks. So it's been, the CCCU schools have been a big part of my life, really my whole adult life.
That's awesome. And I did not go to a CCCU school, but my first job out of college was in campus ministry with InterVarsity. So the formation of the next generation of students has been long dear in my heart. I did that for about 8 years. And I really want to just underline for our listeners how critical the work of everybody in this room is in terms of the formation of the next generation, because Christianity is not inherited. There's no genetic, sort of marker for Christianity, all right? And even in cultures which have relied on cultural transmission for Christianity quickly dies out. Christianity is following Jesus, and that is a process that requires formation. And the formation work requires work. It is labor. And these are all laborers in that work. And I'm reminded of Paul in Galatians 4:19, when he talks about the work of formation as labor. I mean, a different kind of labor. He says, I am in birth pangs until Christ is formed in you. And so these are the laborers that are doing the work of formation. And David, we get a chance to at least try to help them.
If we can.
If we can. So we're going to do this, though, in a way. We're going to talk about several things that we believe the next generation of Christians need. But we're going to do it in a format that is familiar to the friendship of David and me. So David and I were friends for about 30 years because we were part of the same fantasy baseball league, okay? So how many here are part of either football or baseball or some other sport, part of a fantasy league of some sort? Okay, so
that's a pretty good number of fellow nerds. I appreciate it.
So for those of you who don't know what this is, fantasy leagues, sports leagues, are basically where you draft players that are playing in the real world, and you construct a team made of those players, and your team does as well or as poorly as the players you drafted. All right. And so David and I have been part of the same fantasy baseball league for 30 years. We gather together as a group of 20 friends from your law school and my undergraduate, sort of sphere in Boston. And every year, for 30 years now, we've gathered back together in person to have fun and reunite, but also to do the draft. And David, I think it's fair to say that you and I have somewhat different drafting approaches. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yes. I stopped following baseball about 20 years ago. I only have so much room in the old hard drive, and I've got a lot of room for NBA basketball. I've got a lot of room for pro and college football. I've got a lot of room for DC and Marvel movies. I've got a lot of room for every adaptation of anything Lord of the Rings. I can't fit baseball in there.
Baseball gets purged from the round.
Yeah, so I don't even know who plays on any team. And so I hit auto draft and then make fun of everybody the entire rest of the time.
Okay, David, how many fantasy baseball league in our league, how many championships have you won?
2.
Okay, here's how many I've won. 2. Okay, I've won the same number, and I pour over every year the deep dive. I can name for you the starting rotation, projected rotation of the Florida Miami Marlins, right? David, can you name a single Miami Marlins player?
I didn't know they were called the Miami Marlins. I thought they were still the Florida Marlins.
Right.
So, okay.
So we've won the same number of championships, and this is the biggest challenge to my belief in a just God. No theodicy can explain properly to me why we have won the same number of championships. Okay, but the beauty of the fantasy draft is basically it forces you to think, what will you need in the future? Because you're projecting into the upcoming season, and you're basically drafting for traits. You're drafting for, I need a power, I need offense, I need defense, or whatever trait you feel you need in the future. That's what dictates your draft, order, right? And so we thought it would be fun to do a fantasy draft for Team Next Generation Christian. Okay, so what traits would we draft if we thought, we're trying to prepare for the next generation of Christians to thrive? So that's what we're gonna do. So we're gonna go round by round, and we'll each pick in one round of the draft, and then the other will comment on the other's pick. So that's where we're gonna start. And David, because you are now a regular guest of the podcast, no longer a full-time co-host, I felt I should honor you by giving you the first round draft pick.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so
you're on the clock.
This is been a fun exercise for me to think through, because you're talking about what are we prioritizing for the next generation. And my first pick, and this is going to be pretty obvious, but I'm going to explain it a little bit, okay? So my first pick is the fruit of the Spirit, okay? And why would I pick the fruit of the Spirit over theology, correct theology? Why would I pick the fruit of the Spirit as the first thing? Is because we have, as a Christian culture, participated fully in the animosity of the age. Okay, so if you're going to look at what is one of the single most salient characteristics of American life right now, and it is called negative partisanship. Okay, so what is negative partisanship? Negative partisanship is a affiliation with your partisan political tribe, not because you necessarily love it or the ideas that it espouses, but because you hate or fear the other side. So it's rooted in a deeply negative emotion. And this is an extraordinarily powerful influence right now in the United States of America. So how powerful is it? If you go and look at some of the research done by a group called More in Common, which has looked at what it calls the hidden tribes of American life, it looks at the people who are most animated by partisan, who possess the strongest partisan motivations. And what you'll see is they have incredibly, profoundly negative views of the other side. Very negative views. 89%, for example, of devoted conservatives who are disproportionately Christian view every Democrat as brainwashed, okay? That's just one statistic of many. You can go through negative characteristic, brainwashed, bigoted, racist, you name it, and overwhelming majorities of American partisans are fully bought in on this. So there's even something now called lethal mass partisanship. And what is lethal mass partisanship? It is the belief that the world would be better off if a significant percentage of your political opponents just died. Okay, and about 20% of American adults believe that, including many Christians. Now, you might have a glass half full view and go, 80% of American adults don't want their political opponents to die. Yay. But the 20% of adults who do want their political opponents or feel like the world would be better off if they died is about 45 million Americans are that committed to hatred and animosity. Okay, so at this moment when American life is so dominated by animosity, This is exactly the moment when a spirit-filled, fruit of the Spirit animated Christian community should be blazing forth counterculturally, okay? And not just counterculturally in the workplace, not just counterculturally as a student in a Christian school or a secular school, but counterculturally in American politics. We're not just one partisan tribe to be mobilized. We are the servants of Jesus Christ. We follow Jesus Christ. The thing that is supposed to characterize us is the fruit of the Spirit. How are you supposed to know that you've interacted with a Christian? It's not necessarily that they're going to be able to tell you all of the proper theology. Okay? Even demons have good theology, right? What's the marker? The marker is the fruit of the Spirit. And so this is a moment in a time of animosity when the markers that the love of Jesus Christ within us should be exploding forth from the Christian community. And sadly, I think it's pretty fair to say they're not. They're just not, especially not in politics. And don't for a minute try to compartmentalize politics and say, well, I mean, look, I might own the libs nonstop on Twitter, but if you met me outside of the online world, I'm really nice. You know, it's about like saying in some ways, well, you know, I'm really awesome to all of my employees and I'm really kind to my kids. So you just have to overlook all the porn I watch. Like we just don't compartmentalize our morality like that. And the other thing about it is with a decreasing level of church attendance in this country, a decreasing level of religious affiliation, an increasing number of people are encountering Christians either initially or primarily through our participation in politics. And so you got to ask yourself, is that where we're putting our best foot forward? I don't think you actually have to ask yourself that at all because you know the answer. And also, I'm going to let you react after I finish my filibuster, but I'm also noting this as we Christians are fighting amongst ourselves. And again, I'm sorry if you're on Twitter, but this is where it is most prevalent and most common. As we fight amongst ourselves, we're often extremely interested in doctrine and not at all interested in kindness. We're extremely interested in partisan affiliation and not at all interested in kindness. And to the point where many times, and I've seen this with my own eyes, when there is scandal within the church, we will overlook it, we will ignore it, even if that scandal involves cruelty to fellow believers. We don't want to talk about it, we don't want to look it in the face, because it might undermine our fighting position. It might undermine our sense of tribal solidarity. And in so doing, we are cruel to people, we are indifferent to human suffering, and in many ways, we actually turn our back on justice itself in our interactions with others. So my first draft choice for this new generation is the fruit of the Spirit. That we need to be teaching young people what are the markers? How is it that we know? How do we understand that we're interacting with a follower of Christ? And that's why the fruit of the Spirit is my first choice.
It's a solid first round draft pick.
Thank you.
It's hard to argue with the Holy Spirit as the number one round draft pick.
Thank you.
Third person of the Trinity.
Yes.
Probably commands a very high, contract that they're going to require. But so it makes me think when we talk about the Spirit, about what we just heard at this conference a little while ago. We were at this right before dinner started. We heard a report from Asbury. And if you're listening to this podcast, you may have heard sort of the news circulating in Christian circles of a seeming outpouring of the Spirit happening at Asbury University. And this is the outpouring of the Spirit. And so you would think, okay, well, how does this connect with what David just said? And I think it's very important to think about this because, let me use the draft metaphor here. So when you're drafting, what you really want to pay attention to is the track record, the long-term track record that you're drafting. You really want to be careful about something a flashy player that just had a great season. It could easily have been a fluke, right? So you want to bias towards track record, long-term track record. And I think of this when this question is starting to circulate among us Christians about what do you think about Asbury? What do you think is going on there, right? I think we should adopt sort of that same draft framework. First of all, we should be open to it. We should absolutely not be cynical. We should absolutely be open, welcoming, hungering. I mean, my goodness, do we not need the outpouring of the Holy Spirit? And does this generation not need the outpouring of the Spirit? So we should absolutely be hungry for it. But if we want to evaluate it, which at some point we will have to, and we should bias towards the long-term track record versus the flashy short-term just evidence of what is immediately happening. And I think that's something that we ought to really pay attention to is the fruit of the Spirit, not just the long worship sessions and the kind of long marathon prayer sessions. Is it bearing fruit, especially in the kind of peace, patience, gentleness, kindness? And is it also especially standing forth, the way David's talking about, as a counterpoint to the current culture, especially the current political culture? So it will be fascinating to me to see what is the outworkings of Asbury, the revival that I hope and believe is happening there on the political culture that is surrounding Asbury and outward from there. If that's happening, if we find Christians blazing forth a different way of relating to each other around politics and the culture wars that is truly characterized by the fruits of the Spirit, then we'll know it's real. Then we know it's genuine and it has a track record.
Well, and one thing about track records, I am not a historian of Asbury revivals, but I did grow up near Asbury, so that makes me a quasi-expert. But one of the things that's interesting to me about from what I know of the history of the Asbury revivals is this is very consistent with the history of revivals at Asbury, which they are very repentance-focused, as opposed to experience-focused of what we've seen in other revival type outpourings and outbreaks in other places. And one thing that I have seen from the Asbury lineage is this lineage of a focus on quiet repentance and humbling yourself before Jesus in a way that maybe some of the more exuberant expressions of revival, and I am not against exuberant expressions of revival, but in a way that some of the more exuberant expressions will sometimes draw people for the experience. What I have seen in the history, in the lineage of some of these Asbury revivals, is people being drawn for the repentance. And that's a very, very powerful and countercultural thing.
All right, so we're going to move to round 2 now, and that passes it over to me. And my second round draft pick is a new spiritual approach, a new Christian approach to anxiety. So why am I picking this so high? Well, let me take a quick poll of the room. Raise your hand for how many of you have a family member or an extended family member or a friend struggling with anxiety? That's almost the entire room, David. Anxiety is at a massive upswing. This is the new pandemic that we're in. It's a mental health epidemic. The scale is staggering. In 2011, when they surveyed college students for whether they were suffering from significant anxiety struggles, that figure was 1 in 10 back in 2011. 2019, before the pandemic, 2019, that figure had risen to 1 in 4. So that's a massive increase. That's an epidemic proportion. And all the researchers believe that the numbers are only going higher. The CDC just recently released a report. Something like 1 in 3 teenage girls are suffering from severe anxiety, depression, or some other mental health disorder. It's a massive outbreak. Now, you can ask the question, why? And that would be a very complicated sort of question to ask if you're looking for why did this upsurge happen in terms of all the causal factors. There's a lot going on. Certainly, I think a leading hypothesis advanced by Jonathan Haidt is that smartphone addiction is at least a a very strong culprit, and I think the data shows the spike took place right around 2012. That's when smartphone adoption entered the mainstream, right? So there's a lot of correlate, but the studies are all fuzzy in terms of showing direct cause effects. So the question of why was this caused is fuzzy. But there's a different way you can ask the question why, which is sort of like when you ask, why was there massive flooding in New Orleans after Katrina? Well, meteorologically, in the causal factors, it's very complex, right? But there's also a question of why did the flood overwhelm the defenses? Why did the levees break? Right? There's a second question of why are our sort of measures and structures and practices that are supposed to contain this, why are they collapsing? And that's the question that I want to ask, and I believe there's an answer, at least one answer to that, which is at least in the Christian community, our spiritual approach to anxiety is broken and is deeply flawed. And the way I would characterize it is basically, simplistically say, you have two big approaches and responses to anxiety. One is basically, you might characterize it as pray anxiety away. So this is strong in a lot of different Christian traditions, not all, but especially charismatic, Pentecostal traditions can lean into this very heavily. The notion that anxiety is a flaw, is a problem, maybe even a sin or a sign of a lack of faith, right? So you're supposed to pray anxiety away, or maybe scripture memory verse anxiety away, but it's a problem, and through spiritual means, you're supposed to eliminate it, okay? Or there's another stream, even within Christianity, that says, we'll outsource it to secular mental health, and they will pill it away, or they will therapeutize it away. Now, I'm actually a big fan of medication and therapy, and rightly used. I've benefited from myself. But treating anxiety as a problem strips it of any spiritual meaning, of any spiritual purpose. And this is where I think Christians really need a correction, which is that anxiety is not a problem fundamentally. It is not a flaw. It is not a sin or a sign of lack of faith. It is profoundly human. It is a deeply human condition. And how do we know that? Because the scriptures are all clear that Jesus suffered anxiety. Right? Read the Gethsemane passages. They're all very clear. Jesus was anxious, distressed, overwhelmed with sorrow, sweating profusely. These are all classic signs of anxiety. I am overwhelmed, distressed. John 12, John is the only gospel that doesn't have the Gethsemane passage, and it goes out of its way to describe Jesus as deeply sorrowed and troubled as he approaches the cross, John 12. So this is fundamental to the gospel portrayal of Jesus, that Jesus, as he faced the future, a future of loss, that he was deeply emotionally affected by all the characteristics that you would call anxiety. So we need a reframing of anxiety, not as a problem to eliminate, but rather as an opportunity for growth. Right? That anxiety is a deeply human experience that is the opportunity for growth. It's not like we get rid of anxiety and then we can be close to Jesus. It's actually we go through anxiety to meet Jesus. Right? It is the place where we meet Jesus because Jesus himself has embraced the human condition, including the human condition of anxiety. And this is going to require us to do a reframe. And so this is, I think, an important task for Christian colleges and universities. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is because, one, you have the youth. You have the next generation, which is suffering these high rates. But the other reason is you have a chance to reframe it not as simply a problem to solve so we can do other things. Which is, and I want to caution all of you administrators of how you think about anxiety, because it can be tempting to fall into that frame of it is a problem to eliminate so that we can do the stuff we really were meant to do, right? So that we institutionally even silo off this into our student life, our campus ministry, or something else. And then the thinking, even subconsciously, is, okay, fix them up, or at least get them functioning basically enough so we can get them back into class, and then they can learn the real things of formation. And I think this is a fundamentally flawed way to think of anxiety, because anxiety it's so human. You can't understand human realities unless you understand anxiety, right? It's, one way to think about this is I'm picking the quarterback, right? The quarterback is the decision-making person in the team. We tend to think it's rational intellectual thought that is the quarterback. And all the research says it's the emotional center. It's what Jonathan Haidt calls it's the elephant versus the rider, right? It's the elephant that actually, our emotional selves that actually move us. And so if we're not addressing the emotional component of our people, of our students, all of our thoughts are just like bouncing off of them. they're not hearing you, right? And anxiety actually, it's actually foundational. It's foundational even to understanding any of your disciplines, right? Think about, topics that academically, any university, but Christian college would need to address. David talked a little about this, politics, race, and economics, right? Every school should be addressing these three topics. If you're not doing your job, right? Politics, you just can't understand what's happening in politics if you don't understand anxiety, right? Like all of the political polarization, all of the conspiracy theories, all of the extremism, it is deeply soaked in anxiety. It's the driver, it's the emotional driver. You can tell them all you want about your public theology and how you ought to think about this, but if you don't address anxiety, you're not addressing the true decision maker. Race. Boy, do you want to actually raise the blood pressure in the room? Just start talking about race. So if we do not equip our people, our students, to deal with anxiety, we can't actually talk about race. The anxiety goes too high up for everybody, people of color and white people, okay? So we need to build up our response to anxiety if we're gonna talk about race. Economics, economics has long been dominated by the classical economic school that thinks we're all rational actors. And all of the interesting economic research shows, in the field of behavioral economics shows, actually what they're discovering is people are very anxious. That's actually how they make economic decisions. They're very loss avoidant. You give them the same option of gain and the same option of loss, they will always choose to avoid the loss regardless of what, right? So I'm just saying that as an example of if you even want to teach your fields, the academic fields, but you don't have a way to address anxiety, you're missing the boat, all right? And so if we want to form Christians in how they think, like in politics, race, or economics, we have to reform how they experience anxiety. So that's my number 2 draft pick.
What I like about that is, I don't know if y'all have ever experienced this, but I grew up and I was taught that anxiety is something that that a Christian should not be anxious. A Christian should not be anxious. That is not what Christians do. And so then what would happen is if I got anxious, I would then become anxious about being anxious. So now I'm anxious about my lack of faith, right? And it just compounds and it compounds. And it was recentering around, wait, if Jesus, who knew that he knew he was going to conquer death and hell, like he knew he was going to conquer death and hell, is facing this incredible ordeal. And he is obviously anxious about it. Then that helped me really reframe. And it also, I also like this notion of walking through it rather than avoiding it. And I think that also has some applications to grief as well.
100%, that's right.
A lot of us in this room are grieving. I remember when I came back from Iraq, I was grieving a lot. I had never been around so much death in my life, including of people I loved. And I didn't have time to grieve them when I was there because it was like next thing. People's lives were on the line every day and you couldn't grieve. You just worked, you moved. And then when I came home, all the grief came crashing down. And one of the first things I thought was, how can I get over this? How can I get past this? And then I realized I don't want to quote a Marvel TV show, but I'm gonna.
You're going to the source text now.
I'm going to the source text. Although that would be DC more than Marvel, but that's a whole other conversation. Oh, wait a minute. Wait just a minute. But it was in the course of, oh my goodness, why am I blanking on the show? Help me with the show, the WandaVision. Okay, WandaVision, it's a show about her grieving. her grieving all of her losses and all of the horrible wars of the Avengers have fought. And somebody says to her, grief is a love remembered. And that was, y'all need to be watching more comic book content. That's good stuff. But I had hit that point. I remember I was running one day and I had like maybe my 20th consecutive day where I couldn't stop tears from coming to my eyes at just random moments. And I remember thinking, this is horrible. And then as I was running, it was as if the Holy Spirit said, no, all of this grief is a marker of your love. And I thought, okay, it's okay to grieve. It's not something to just race past. And I think we do that on all of these things that do impair our sort of joy in the moment, where we say we got to fix that. So in this time, in this moment, I can be happy. And while there's an enormous amount of joy in this life, and there really is, and there's an enormous amount of joy in following Jesus Christ, what is one of the things that he says to us? Take up your cross, which for him was anxious, right? So for us, so I love that, Curtis. Okay, my number, I'm in number 3.
Third round. Yes.
Third round. Okay. So my third round is related to my first round. So as my 2-time championship indicates, I build very deliberately.
Yes.
I build like building a complex Lego set. So my third pick is related to the first, but it is how do we connect the fruit of the Spirit to our political presence in this country? And I choose a verse that is really the theme verse for a project that you and I are working on about what we're calling the after party. It's a word for a post-partisan view of a Christian political witness. And that verse is Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? To act justly, to love mercy or love kindness in some translations, and to walk humbly with the Lord your God. And what's so marvelous about this verse, and I'm always going to pay attention to a verse that begins with a question, what does the Lord require of you, O man? That's like, do you remember this is a young crowd, so you may not. Who remembers the old E.F. Hutton commercials where there's like a busy restaurant and someone says, my broker is E.F. Hutton, and E.F. Hutton says, and the whole restaurant goes quiet. Like nobody moves because they want to hear what E.F. Hutton says. So my view is if a verse says, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It's like E.F. Hutton time. Act justly, love kindness, walk humbly. And that's such a marvelous construct for how we pursue justice in our society. So there are people who will shun the pursuit of justice because that can get contentious, right? But we cannot shun the pursuit of justice. It is the first of the 3 things. Act justly. We have to pursue justice. That is not optional. That is a command, okay? And pursuing justice can be divisive. It really can be divisive. But nobody, look, one of the foremost Christian political movements in the history of humanity is the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is one of the most successful, although there's still work to do, but most successful politically, Christian political movements of the last 200 years, if not more. And yet no one would say that there wasn't a lot of division then, right? But there was no option but to pursue justice. But then what? If you dive into the King philosophy of nonviolence, and multiple people have explained this, is that, look, at all points, there was never going to be anything but love for those who persecuted. And this was persecution. This wasn't annoyance, which is most of what we Christians call persecution now. This was persecution, yet with kindness returned for hatred. but without forgetting justice, right? So you had the pursuit of justice with enormous courage, side by side with kindness, side by side with mercy. In other words, welcoming people when they repented, right? So kindness, mercy, and then the last one is humility. And this one, I think, when I had the privilege of teaching a 1-credit course on political theology at Covenant College. Anyone here? All right, Covenant, okay. And I reversed the order. I was saying, if you're a young Christian and you're walking into contentious conversations, lead with your humility. You're not abandoning justice, but lead with humility. Why should you lead with humility? Because problems in this country are complicated. They're complicated. Doesn't mean they're not solvable, doesn't mean there isn't a right answer, but they're complicated. So if you want to talk about racial justice, who's got that figured out, right? Now, should we want to achieve racial justice? Yes. What does that mean? It means I walk in with a listening posture. Okay, I have ideas about things that fall within my zones in areas of expertise, particularly in constitutional law and legal history. I have ideas, but I want to walk in with humility in a listening posture. And then as I am listening, I'm emphasizing kindness in my approach to the fellow human being across the table, and I'm never neglecting justice. And what I feel like happens often is that the thing that is hardest for us, we shun, and one of those qualities that's easiest for us, we embrace. So there are some people, particularly on Twitter, they're the team justice. You know, they're going to tell you what they think, absolutely emphatically, and they're going to redefine that as kindness. They're going to say, yep, you getting exposed to a tsunami of my truth is kindness. Doesn't feel like it, though. It doesn't really feel like it. And so some people are all about justice and they forget about kindness. And some people see the division of politics and they'll run from it and thereby forsake justice in the quest for kindness. And then some folks are just paralyzed by a lack of knowledge. They just don't know. They don't know how to know. And so they retreat. I don't know if y'all have seen the Homer Simpson gif of him slowly walking back into the shrubbery. That's a lot of us these days. It's so toxic out there. So they'll slowly walk back into the shrubbery. And so when I think of what we need as we're living in this highly contentious, excessively politicized world, a political witness in which Christians are walking in, with an emphasis on justice and kindness and humility as a triple interlocking obligation.
I love that. And one of the ways my summary of that is we need a reframing of the Christian political identity from the what to the how, right? From the what to the how. Christian political identity has been so thoroughly dominated that we think we know very precisely to be a Christian is to be about these whats, this policy, this party's platform, or even this party's candidate, right? That's a what. What David is talking about is the how. The how. The Micah 6:8 is about the how. And the how, let's just be clear. You can draw a much clearer straight line from Jesus to these hows than you can to any particular set of whats. It doesn't mean the whats don't matter. I'm not saying chuck it out. But in terms of clarity, of what should define the radical sort of witness, the countercultural witness of Christian politics, the how is what is clear. And in this particular cultural moment, that how is radical, right? To be kind, to be humble, to love truth, to forgive your enemies. That is radical in this political moment. And I think that's really important, this reframing from the what to the how. It's really important for all Christian institutions, but I think especially for all of you in the audience, for Christian higher ed. And the reason is if you allow yourselves to be politically defined by the current political framing, which is so much about the what, right? That you are going to get squeezed in the middle. You will get squeezed in the middle because the polarizing options will squeeze you out. There will, if you kind of tilt, if you think, we're moderates, right? We might tilt progressive a little bit. You know what? You're never going to be more progressive than a secular higher campus. They are going to out-progressivize you, and right, and they're going to out-woke you. And for the students that are drawn to that, they're going to go there, right? Also, similarly, like we're classic conservatives, right? You're never going to be more conservative than the sort of radical right. And so for the students that are attracted to that, they're going to go there. So in a polarizing situation, right, which is what we're in now, those who try to stake out the quote-unquote moderate middle, they get squeezed, right?
Well, and one thing I want to say, I don't want to use the word moderate, because what often happens is that Christians are quite radical, but just not in a way that maps on to the current partisan alignment.
Well, that's my point, is that's why I don't think the moderate label works. I think, the Christian sort of witness, and I think especially the Christian college and university, needs to reframe the divide. It is not between the what, left and right, red, blue, on the what's. It's a different axis. And I think that axis has to revolve around the how. And that that's where we come together, and that's where I think we stand out. And so...
Just to be a little more provocative.
A little more.
Just a little more. No, we have not been. I've barely gotten started with provocation. But we look at politics through a lens totally different from any other area of life. So if you talk to a Christian student and they've been formed in church and you say, what does it mean to be a Christian student? They're not going to go immediately to the ultimate outcome. It means me getting all A's, right? I need to be excellent and to glorify the Lord through my excellence, and I'm going to get all A's. They're also going to say, I need to love my classmates. I need to study with integrity. If there's an honor code at the school, I'm going to comply with the honor code. I'm going to be respectful to my professors. There's a whole host of ways in which you, as a Christian, are called to be a student. Similarly with a businessman. What does it mean to be a Christian businessman? Well, the Lord calls me to excellence, maximum profits. No. How do I treat my customers? How do I treat my clients? How do I treat my peers? How do I treat my subordinates? How do I treat my superiors? All of these things are part of the witness. And then let's say, Curtis, your business is failing, like it's just failing. If I went to you and I said, this is a real emergency, you might have to move, you might have to sell your house, pull your kids out of the school that they love. You know what you need to do? You need to commit some light consumer fraud. You would say, absolutely, every Christian businessman would say, nope, not going to commit consumer fraud. God's going to take care of me. God is in control. Then I go, okay, you're right. Hire somebody who will commit fraud for you. And they'd say, no, are you kidding me? That is not the way you should act. I am not relieved of sin by delegating it to my employee. I think some of you know where I'm going on this. I'm really worried about this country. This country is going in a bad direction. So I think we might need to lie. I think we might need to demonstrate a lack of integrity. I think the ends might need to justify the means. No, I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to hire the people to do it for me. That's the witness right now of the church. Let's just be honest. That's the witness right now of the church is I'm going to hire people to lie and crush my enemies for me. That doesn't relieve you of the obligation that you're not doing it yourself when you hired the person who is. And that's why for a long time, evangelicals understood this at kind of an instinctive level. Every poll out there that existed had evangelicals said, character is a key consideration for who can lead this country or lead my state or lead my city. And now evangelicals are lowest on that scale. We're least likely to say that character matters. And I have the hardest time justifying that biblically. I have the hardest time. And I'm open. Someone afterwards, please tell me. I will listen with kindness and humility. But I think you're advocating injustice. So, no. And I think that we really have had a failure in this arena when it comes to politics, we say, well, it's the policies. It's the policies. It's not the people. It's the policies. And yet, in what area of leadership In what area of leadership do we say that? In any other area? Do we say that about the presidents of your universities? That they can be the lowest of the low character, but as long as the cash comes in and the doors stay open, it's all good. No, not one of you would say that. And so I feel like it's a really incredibly important. Let's look at it this way. Both political parties cannot win a single national election without their Bible-believing bases. Think of it like this. White evangelicals, Republicans can't win dog catcher without the white evangelical vote. Okay? Black Democrats are the community of people who go to church just as much as white evangelicals. The only people who beat black Protestants and white evangelicals are Mormons. They beat all of us on regular church attendance. But as far as the people who attend church, believe in the Bible, neither party can win without Bible-believing Christians supporting them. So guess what? That means you're not super persecuted. It means you're really powerful. It means you're really powerful. It means you have a veto power over candidates, over the fortunes of the two great political parties in the most powerful country in the world. And yet we run around with a victim grievance mentality. It blows my mind. Okay, I'm done.
All right. So we're going to go with the last round. Fourth round is going to be the last round. And of course, I get to the last pick. David, do you know what I'm going to pick?
I know what you're going to pick. Both because I know you and we also talked about it.
So I am going to pick that what the next generation of Christians need is a theology of institutions. A theology of institutions. Why does the next generation of Christians need this? Because currently they don't have one. Right? They do not think in institutional terms because we have not trained them or equipped them how to think theologically about institutions. We help them think individually, about the family, about the church, maybe about the state as the one exception. But for the most part, we have not taught them to think about the corporation, the nonprofit, the small business, the civic association, and what role does that being, and I'm using that word very deliberately, does that institutional being have in God's story of redemption? We just don't teach them to think that way. And because of that, they think an institution is it's a thing. It's a thing. They think, because they have absorbed the dominant cultural ethos that thinks instrumentally about institutions. In other words, does the institution give me what I want? And if so, then that's good. If it doesn't give me what I want, then it's bad. That's how we treat a tool, right? If the tool's working, if it delivers the result, if the hammer works, then we keep it. The moment it's broken, in this consumer age, we toss it aside, right? We don't even think about repairing it. It's not worth the effort. And when we treat our institutions the way we treat a tool, thinking instrumentally about institutions, we adopt the same posture, right? We will, if it's giving us what we want, great, I'll keep supporting it. The moment it doesn't do what I want, I'll chuck it aside, right? That leads to sort of unsustainable social life, because what sustains our social life is institutions. And so now Christians are following the culture and adopting this very instrumental, short-term, and ultimately unforgiving attitude towards our institutions. And the forgiveness is key here, because we are sending our students out not into flawless, perfect institutions. We're sending them out into deeply flawed and broken institutions at every level. Corporations, government, you name it. We have flawed institutions. There's a longer story of why this is especially a moment of flawed institutions. But that's what we're sending our students out to. If they do not have a theology, a narrative that makes sense of flawed institutions, other than as a thing that you toss aside once it's broken, then they're just going to check out. They're going to check out of those institutions, either actually check out or just psychically, emotionally, and spiritually check out and live just like my spiritual life is over here and my work and other institutional life is over there, and that has nothing to do with one another. And it's because we don't know how to think about institutions as beings, as spiritual beings, right? Because only beings are ones, and ones that bear the image of God are ones that we think as actually, well, they're flawed, but I still will have hope for them. I still will participate in their redemption. I will forgive them. We don't forgive a tool. We don't forgive a hammer. We forgive people, right? We've been trained to do that. We need to start thinking about institutions as human, as made of human beings they're not the same thing as an individual, but they're not totally different from a human individual either. They're both human. And therefore, the institutions also bear in their own way the image of God. Not in the exact same way an individual does, but in its own way. It's the collective way that humans collectively reflect the character of God. And only when we start recasting the imagination of our people to think of institutions that way, will they be motivated to think, okay, this institution is flawed, but you know what? I'm going to stick in there. I'm going to seek the redemption of this institution. And where it's done wrong, I'm going to be extending mercy and forgiveness. And I'm also going to hold it accountable. Because guess what? The only things you hold accountable are actually human beings, right? We don't hold when a hammer breaks down, we don't think, you awful, filthy, morally corrupt hammer, no, it's a thing. You toss it aside, right? So we only have moral expectations for things that are human, that reflect something of God's image in the world. And therefore, our ability to not only redeem, but also to hold institutions morally accountable requires that we have a theology of institutions. And that's what's missing right now. And that, I think, is one of the challenges for all of you who are about the formation of ideas and the transmission of ideas, because this is a missing piece in our toolkit right now.
I will just say one correction. I have said very nasty things to tools, particularly my Apple desktop. When it wouldn't play, I realized there wasn't a very good gaming machine, and I'd spent a lot of money on it, and it was lagging out when I was playing World of Warcraft.
That's a tragedy, David.
That's very sad. Yeah. And I said awful things. Travesty. I said awful things to it. But the thing I think is really important about when we love an institution, and many of us belong to institutions we love. I love the institution of my college, Lipscomb University. I love that institution. And there are a lot of institutions that we tend to love more or less depending sort of on what side of the political spectrum we are, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that I think is really important when we do find an institution that we love, that if we're going to love it, we're going to have to put in place mechanisms of accountability for it. Because if you take any institution and you give it authority and you insulate it from accountability, corruption is going to follow like night follows day. And one of the things that we have seen in a distressing number of the scandals that we've seen in major Christian institutions around this country, what have you seen? They've been largely captured by a very prominent or powerful or celebrity type figure who has then been very busy insulating himself from accountability. And they create institutions that have real value and have done good things. But, think of all of the good people, for example, who worked at Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. And yet now that's all, that institution is ashes. It's ashes. And one of the reasons why it's ashes is because it was very good at protecting its founder from accountability. And we can do this all day long. And it's very interesting to me when I read the New Testament and you look at this, the early church, this was an early institution, an early church, how much time Paul focuses on the integrity of this very small, struggling, incredibly persecuted institution versus how much time he spends owning the Romans, it's a big disparity. It's a big disparity because he realizes that this institution, this budding institution of the early church, has to have integrity. It has to have accountability. And so we should not be afraid of that for institutions. Every institution that we love should be layered up with accountability. One institution that I've been a part of and that I have enormous respect for is the military. Well, in the early 1970s, it was a broken institution. It was broken. Post-Vietnam, it was overrun with drug addiction. It was overrun with crime. It was overrun with incompetence. And what is one of the things that they did? They layered it up with accountability. They made it to where there was accountability for failure. Not perfect. I think I see some folks in uniform back here and they'd probably say, it's not perfect. It's not. I know it's not. I've been there. But layering up this institution that has immense power with accountability only helped it. And I think that you cannot buy the lie that comes in that says if you're holding your own institutions accountable, that you're somehow disloyal. That is not, that's the opposite of the truth.
Well, you know, if you follow the NFL draft, it takes place over 2 entire days. So David and I could do that if you want. I mean, we could just spend here all day.
If it's NFL, not if it's baseball. Yeah.
I'm saying our draft for the next team next generation. We could go for 12 rounds here, but we need to let these college administrators and leaders get some shut-eye here, I think.
Yes.
You have been a great audience. Give yourself a hand. Thank you so much. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with the leaders here at the Council for Christian Colleges and University doing great work. And I invite all of you in the audience and all of you listening at home to come join us next week at the Good Faith Podcast, where we will once again gather around the campfire.